Hey, it's Chris. Today we're talking about iPad Pro criticisms over the years because, interestingly enough, the more the iPad Pro changes, the more the criticisms don't. Quick announcement, Freeform Unleashed, my new course, is up for pre-sale, linked up down below. Somehow, no matter what Apple seems to add to the iPad Pro, somebody out there in reviewer land is going to say, it's really not enough. It's not enough of a Mac, not enough Pro apps. My wallet isn't big enough to afford all the accessories. I want to add some context to the discussion. Let's go back in time and look at some of the bad things, the negative things that have been said about the iPad Pro lineup over the years. So going back to the original 12.9 inch, which came out in 2015, it cost $799. Immediately, reviewers are skeptical about things like the size, the battery life, the apps that were available, the potential market appeal, and get this, many were saying that it was overkill. Now, interestingly enough, one of the first things that people complained about was the apps, not enough Pro apps. Specifically, The Verge was complaining there's no Final Cut Pro. We all know that's been fixed now. But what's new is also what's old in the realm of critiques here, because people have never stopped complaining about the Pro apps. At the time, you saw reviewers complaining that the smart keyboard case was overpriced, and guess what? That sounds kind of familiar too, right? Also, back in the day when the first big iPad Pro launched, it did come out before the smaller versions, by the way, people were saying, you can't hold this one-handed. It's just unwieldy. But what's funny is it was never really meant to be used one-handed. People took one look at it and thought about how they used previous iPads and then tried to pigeonhole the new iPad into their old mold. From 2015, I found a nugget in the Digital Trends review where they said, imagine trying to do all your work on a giant phone. And that is a criticism that has stuck around for all of these years, almost a decade now. PC Mag said that a touch-centric UI with a keyboard is awkward. I think that was another instance of people saying, I don't really get this. Why are you giving this to me, Apple? Based on my previous experience with an iPad, I don't know how to use this or what I would use it for. And we all know how that played out. Then in 2016, the smaller 9.7 inch iPad Pro came out. But here CNET comes on the scene and says, this is not a laptop killer. And that's a criticism that just never went away. It never died, even though it never should have been around in the first place. And Apple's partly to blame for that with some of the marketing that they did over the years. Like, what is a computer?
What you doing on your computer?
What's a computer?
But this is the frame that so many people still look at the iPad Pro through. This is the lens. Is it a laptop killer? It's not, I'm not interested. It's as if people think that Pro means laptop form, as if that's the final form of perfection when it comes to mobile computing. The Engadget review that year was crazy. The 9.7 inch Pro is a tablet that only aspires to be as versatile as a PC. Engadget, honestly, has been one of my least favorite tech blogs of all time, because they also sat there and said, what beyond the marketing makes the iPad here a Pro? But here's the thing, when you talk about Pro, and I made a whole video about this once, which I'll link up down below because it goes into this in such depth and detail, you'd be like, okay, Chris is right. But you have to define Pro and what it applies to. Does it mean the device? Does it mean the person using the device? And people are still having that debate today. Before we get any further, if you haven't heard, I've got a new course. It's on Freeform. It's called Freeform Unleashed. It's gonna go way beyond the basics. I'll show you how Freeform can replace many of your other apps. I'll give you tons of ideas of how you can use this beyond anything you've ever imagined. And I'm giving you 50% off while that's in pre-sale. And I'm also gonna give you 50% off Learning to Be Productive just to help celebrate the launch of the upcoming Freeform course. So both of those are linked up down below. By 2017, the 10.5 inch iPad Pro came out, and you had TechRadar saying that the keyboard is necessary, but it's extra, as if that was a bad thing. So the iPad in its form factor is meant to be kind of a transformer-like device. And what's clever about the iPad is that you can use it with the keyboard, but you don't have to. So here you have somebody saying it's necessary because they're fitting into that frame of it has to be a laptop or else, when really options are a good thing, in my opinion. It's just a benefit to be able to get the tablet and add a keyboard. I mean, people had to dig really deep to find something to complain about that year for the iPad. They were down to like, there's no fast charger in the box. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you that the iPad Pro was really starting to gel. People understood what it was, that they didn't really need it to be something that it wasn't. Certain people wanted it to be something that it wasn't, and still wanted to be something that it isn't and probably will never be. But for a market segment, the value proposition was there, and that's why we still have the iPad Pro so many generations later, and it still isn't like a laptop, and I say that gladly. In 2018, we got the 11-inch iPad Pro for the first time, and it looked different than previous iPad Pros, looked much more sleek. The Verge was out there calling it brutalist, or like a reference design. So many new things came that year, but all we heard about was, iOS 12 still has limitations, or it's only got one USB-C port, and that's not going to pay real dividends until more compatible accessories arrive. This was the year that really illustrated for me that no matter what you give people, the reviewers, and I separate reviewers from customers, but it showed me that you can give people what they ask for and they're still going to complain. Now, there were a few small legitimate things to complain about here. Number one, the camera bump on the back. It was huge, and it's still pretty huge. And you get a little wobble if you're using the Apple Pencil, which is one of the main modes of input with the iPad Pro. I get that. If you don't have a case on there, it's not flat. That's kind of weird. Also, and rightly so, The Verge said, Apple's billing this as an all-screen design, but look at those bezels. This is not edge-to-edge display like Apple says. Okay, that's a legit criticism, but it doesn't change the iPad Pro experience. Not really. Now, at the time that the USB-C landed, you saw these complaints saying, well, this doesn't support external storage. That seems like a big oversight. Yes, at the time, that was really annoying, and it's true that Apple's internal storage costs an arm and a leg. No one likes to pay for that on the checkout page when they're getting the new Pros. But that's another good example of something that came later. So Apple introduces these things in phases, and it may take a little bit longer than people want, but Apple usually ends up delivering on what there's enough people clamoring for. Obviously, there's a huge market for iPads, and the Pro represents the best iPad that Apple can currently make. But a paradigm shift like that, it takes some time. Like, this is a device that you can use in unique ways versus Apple's other devices. And that was the year that Apple brought shortcuts to the iPad to help address some of the complaints from power users in particular, saying with the apps that we have, I can't really finish all of my workflows all the way. And the criticism immediately was that, well, this is a stopgap. This is a workaround. It's not very efficient. And The Verge gets the award for the most annoying line of the year in my perspective, which was, but you know what? It's still an iPad. That's how they ended it that year. Yes, amazement, it's still an iPad. Why do you think it's called something other than Mac? It's not a Mac. It is an iPad. What actually was more of a big scandal that year was that Apple didn't support the VP9 codec. I don't know if you remember this. So you couldn't watch YouTube in 4K on your iPad Pro, which again seems silly at this point. If I hadn't brought it up, nobody would even remember that. And that's the case for a lot of these complaints. They get fixed and you didn't even remember there was a problem. And now we can fast forward to the 4th gen 11-inch Pro and the 6th gen 12.9-inch Pro, basically the current models as I sit here and film this, even though something new is looming on the horizon. And though Apple brought a more full-featured multitasking experience with Stage Manager, you still see that same old complaint that iPadOS isn't fully baked. It's just not good enough yet because people are sitting there comparing it to macOS. But again, it turns out the iPad Pro is more or less fully baked in a lot of ways because you're having to look for pretty small things to complain about, like the camera placement on the front. But you also see this age-old complaint at this point with these models that there just isn't a revolutionary improvement over the M1 for people. And that's actually a complaint that you can trace back through the iPad Pro lineup. It's not enough of an improvement. It's not enough of an improvement. The 2018 was very different, so you didn't really hear it that year, but people found things to try to poke holes in immediately. But the Apple Silicon, the M1 chip in itself was already a pretty big deal. So at that point, it was like, what do you need beyond that? It was already so powerful. And there's already so few apps that could even take advantage of that power that it was always just going to be like a future-proofing thing anyways for most people. At this point in the lineup, you also saw people complaining about the hardware choices Apple's making, having the mini LED only available on the 12.9-inch and not available on the 11-inch. How could you have two different Pros where one Pro is better than the other? Well, when you hear me say it like that, I mean, hopefully you hear in your head like, well, it does make sense to have a tiered experience. Maybe not everybody is after the screen being the best experience that they can get. Maybe they just want, the processor or the storage options, and they like a smaller screen. But one complaint that has never gone away, it's been like this since the beginning, and you even heard me mention it at the beginning of this video, is the battery life. People are always looking for more battery life with the iPad Pro, which again, I think speaks positively about the iPad Pro experience in general. People like this so much that they wear the battery down so much that by the end of the day, they're wishing that they had more so they could use this great device more. For this generation, The Verge was talking about how the hover feature is limited in its usefulness beyond specific artistic applications. Okay, well, what if it was mostly meant for specific artistic applications? I mean, I'm not an artist, but I get in there in free form and I do notes all the time. And I like to see that preview of what the highlighter size is going to look like or what ink I'm using because maybe I forgot to switch. it's useful. It's not a big deal, but it's not something to complain about and say, this feature, which was meant for this group of people, doesn't apply to this other group of people, and therefore it's really stupid. So as the next iPad Pro is right on the verge of debuting, I just want to preempt all of the criticisms that are about to come out, and they're gonna fit into this specific mold of the iPad Pro isn't enough X, Y, or Z. I could basically write a review of the next iPad Pro for most of the regular outlets, and you wouldn't even have to change anything, even though I don't even know what the next iPad Pro is technically going to have or look like or do. And that's kind of the main point of this video. The iPad Pro is really cool. It's really great. Anyone in their right mind that can afford it, wants it, they're gonna get one of the iPads because it's just a good tablet that can also do some laptop-like things without needing to be a laptop, I would say. So that's it for this video. Let me know your thoughts down below. Don't forget to check out the courses, and I'll catch you in the next video. Later.